Hello, listeners. Welcome back to Politics Plus Media 101. And when I say welcome back, I say that in part because we have been away a bit for the last couple of weeks. And we've been away for a couple different reasons in either of our cases. In Justin's case, it's because he came down with a bad condition of the novel coronavirus, the COVID-19 virus, which left him completely unable to discuss current events with us. And then in my case, it's because I took a little trip to the Caribbean, visiting a few different islands. But now we're back with you, and we're back after having missed a couple major stories we probably would have talked about if we had been here, one of which is the unfolding controversy over Fox News, as documents have revealed their bad faith around the reporting of the 2020 election. Another one is the deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran to reestablish diplomatic relations and exchange ambassadors and reopen embassies, which was partially brokered by the People's Republic of China. Other stories, this case involving China has to do with Emmanuel Macron, the president of France's visit to that country, and the comments that he made afterwards, which have incensed much of the commentariat in Europe and in the United States. There's also been a number of mass shootings in the United States that have occurred over the last couple of weeks, unfortunately, as they occur every couple of weeks. Justin, are there any other stories that are on your mind that you're sorry that we missed in the last span of time?
Yeah, we definitely will cover most of the stories that you just outlined. I fully expect us to have, international relations shows coming up, probably on those topics, but definitely a show on the Fox News media case, which you and I have been following very closely. What I want to cover today, John, is both the indictment with Trump, but I want to start with some news that is literally breaking today in that Budweiser made a press release response to a conservative attempt by far right-wing folks to boycott the company. So I want to take this from what the heck got everybody angry, why are they boycotting, all the way down to the public relations strategy that Budweiser employed in this press release, and then the response that mainstream media outlets, or at least their journalists, like Ben Collins on the far left, and then Ben Shapiro on the far right, used in response to this press release, because it really was a Rorschach test that kind of shows you where our media landscape is. So the issue is really simple. And I struggle to understand, John, how this would piss anybody off that wasn't trying to manufacture outrage, because it really wasn't aggressing upon anybody. But all that happened was Budweiser had a pretty liberal marketing executive. She embarked on this campaign to try and reframe the image of Budweiser away from what she described as a beer that was popular with frat boys at parties in college to something that was more inclusive. And in doing so, what she did was she embarked on a marketing partnership with Dylan Mulvaney, who is this transgender woman. I had never heard of her before the conservatives started freaking out about this. Apparently, she has half the followers of Taylor Swift on TikTok, which I'm assuming is a ton. And she has obviously risen to national prominence because of this whole kerfluffle. But basically, they just said, hey, Dylan, can you do some advertising for us? And as a result of, including somebody from the LGBTQ community, the right wingers, it started with the real freaks in the movement, the Matt Walshes and Michael Knowles and folks like that, people you just don't want to be around, certainly don't want to be in the same room with. They freaked out. They lost their mind. They said this company is going woke. This is an attack on us, which obviously, John, having somebody from the LGBTQ community advertise a product is not aggressing upon anybody whatsoever. But as a result, they got their followers whipped up. It's now been on Tucker Carlson and Fox News for a full week. And there has been a boycott where Budweiser has responded. So that's kind of where we're at, the state of play. We don't know, just to provide few more facts. Number one, we don't know if this has had an impact. You have folks like Fox News using anecdotal stories from owners of bars down in Tennessee saying they're never going to buy Budweiser again. We don't know what this has had. But additionally, the only other metric we have, John, is I believe the stock price for Budweiser is right at or very close to the price it was before all of this started. So that's kind of the issue at hand. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts specifically on these losers trying to manufacture this outrage, or just conservative boycotts in general, because dude, we've been going through this for what, 5-6 years now?
Yeah, Justin, it is sort of a familiar pattern, the outrage, the calls for boycotts, and the ambiguity about whether any of this is really having an effect. I think you're right that I've observed some of this being on the interwebs, seeing people chatting about this. I saw some of the outrage comments, and you're right that some of them did amuse me. One little bit that I saw that I thought was kind of funny was a gentleman who made an ad for an upstart rival beer company. And he was taking a baseball bat and hitting the Bud Light off of a tee and telling the audience, I will ship my beers to your house if you'd like to buy them. I thought that this was kind of amusing because I can't recall a time that I've ever had beers shipped to my house. If I'd like to have beer, I usually don't get it through the mail. Generally, a corner shop, a bottle shop, grocery store, whatever else is quite easily accessible to most Americans. I can't speak of people who are living in remote areas, but I wonder if a through the mail beer company can ever really become very successful.
We're not talking about fine beer. And I will admit, I've had St. Bernardus number 12 shipped to me through the mail. What is that? That's a very specific Belgian beer created in a very specific brewery, right? It was started by monks hundreds of years ago. It's not the piss water that is your standard American Pilsner. I don't think that Buddy and his son, Jimmy in Tennessee are going to go say, oh, we need to order 10 cases of your worst quality Pilsner and have those delivered to the house. So I do agree with you there, despite being somebody that has ordered beer through the mail.
Justin, when was that? Was that recently that you were ordering beer through the mail?
No, it might have been during the pandemic, which then opens up a different thing.
Because it kind of goes to another point that I wanted to make about all of this, which is that any decline in Budweiser or Bud Light sales can be more easily explained by other factors in the industry than by any supposed boycott by strange incel people on Twitter. I've noticed this pattern a few other times in recent years where the right wing in the social media call for the boycott of a product and claim success, claim that their boycott is having a big impact, when in fact any slowdown in that company, the target company's situation, can often be explained by other factors. So one that's coming to mind is the NFL. A few years ago, the NFL had a controversy because of Colin Kaepernick doing a protest where he would kneel during the national anthem. There were calls to boycott the NFL from many.
And John, just to really define this, because people may forget, he was only kneeling because he was in consultation with a former Navy SEAL who said, this is the way to respect the American flag and to oppose police brutality. So he was opposing police brutality in a way that he thought was respectful to the military. And that sparked this outrage.
Yeah, so his protests during the NFL games where he kneeled during the national anthem caused many in the American right to be very upset, especially on social media. And the NFL itself were getting concerned that it was having an impact. The NFL were responding as if it did. There was the allegation from Mr. Kaepernick that he was, in fact, blacklisted by the NFL because they were so angry that he was negatively impacting their business profile by doing this protest. But from my perspective, I think that the slowdown in NFL viewership figures around this time are much better explained by factors in the media industry largely. Around the time that the NFL started seeing its ratings decline was when viewing habits were shifting broadly against linear viewing, against live television, and towards on-demand and towards streaming. And we saw companies across the live television, linear television industry see their ratings crater. The kind of ratings that a sitcom episode can get are much lower now than they are in the past. The ratings that a TV drama, that TV news channels can get are much lower than they used to be. And this is an industry-wide trend. And you can see that the NFL viewership figures are still way ahead of everything else. So yes, the NFL was declining, but it was only declining as the entire industry declined. And it still maintained a very strong position proportionally to what the rest of the industry was experiencing. If you look at the list of top television broadcasts in a given year, you will see it completely dominated by the NFL. So sure, the NFL was declining, but it probably wasn't really right to attribute much of this to the supposed boycott that came because of Colin Kaepernick's protest. And, like I said, some people in the industry thought that it did and acted as if it did. But Justin, you and I will probably agree, having witnessed some communications stuff, that there is hypersensitivity among marketing communications. They often feel afraid of any kind of reaction. And we've seen that a little bit with Budweiser as well, that they put out some kind of statement in response to this little controversy, even if the controversy wasn't really having a big impact. I think that if Budweiser or Bud Light are experiencing a slowdown, just like the NFL, it can be more easily explained by other things that are happening. We talked about needing to get beer through the mail. One of the reasons you don't really need to get beer through the mail, if you're a specialist, is because of the huge explosive growth of the craft beer industry in the United States. I can go down the street and get whatever monk brewed concoction you were just describing pretty easily now, because there has been a big growth in popularity of these smaller specialized beer brands. And then that, of course, is going to hurt the major conglomerates. Also, the younger generation are drinking much less than our generation or previous generations did. And they're also a smaller generation too. There's fewer of them than there are of us. So that's going to impact the way Bud Light is performing. There's a lot of these big factors that are happening in that industry. So any slowdown can be more easily attributed to those big items than they can what some of these strange people like Matt Walsh are saying on the interwebs.
I think what Matt Walsh said, and I'm going to paraphrase it because I saw it retweeted from somebody. I obviously don't follow that drudge. He was bemoaning the fact that the statement, "you go woke, you go broke," is a fallacy. And he was bemoaning the fact that previous conservative boycotts don't actually work, which kind of underlines your point. So he and others put all of their energy behind this Budweiser boycott. And you know what, dude? It's stayed with the 1% of people that are online in that type of sphere. And that's probably like 1% of Bud Light drinkers even. And then in addition, it leaked over to Fox News and then the right-wing TV and podcasting sphere. So it is really confined to this one group. Now, I would assume conservatives probably drink Bud Light more than liberals. So maybe it is having somewhat of an impact on the business. I don't think it is, but we don't know the numbers. We're not advising Budweiser. To your point, though, Budweiser as a company, this is something that we do. We work in PR, marketing stuff. They had two options, John. One, stay silent. Understand that this is on the right wing. This is the fringes, terminally online. People that generally you don't even want to acknowledge, never mind associate with or rebut, and wait until Monday. Because I was talking to a Fox News expert. They're like, dude, this is going to be done by Monday, and then it's going to be over. Or the second thing that they could do, typically speaking from your traditional PR playbook, is to release a statement that says absolutely nothing, but maybe uses some buzzwords that resonates with the groups that are upset. And I just want to read the press release here, John, and then get your take on how you interpret this press release. And then we can go through some of the reactions of, the Ben Collins, Ben Shapiro. Before I read this press release, without looking at the data and without seeing like any verifiable impact from this boycott, advising Budweiser, advising the CEO, it looks like it's B. Whitworth, I would have told him, dude, just stay silent. Do not do anything. It's going to be over soon. But here's the press release, John. Our responsibility to America is the title. As CEO of a company founded in America's heartland more than 165 years ago, I am responsible for ensuring every consumer feels proud of the beer we brew. We are honored to be part of the fabric of this country, Anheuser-Busch employs more than 18,000 people, and our independent distributors employ an additional 47,000 valued colleagues. We have thousands of partners, millions of fans, and a proud history supporting our communities, military, first responders, sports fans, and hardworking Americans everywhere. We never intended to be part of a discussion that divides people. We are in the business of bringing people together over a beer. My time serving this country taught me the importance of accountability and the values upon which America was founded: freedom, hard work, and respect for one another. As CEO of Anheuser-Busch, I am focused on building and protecting our remarkable history and heritage. I care deeply about this country, this company, our brands, and our partners. I spend much of my time traveling across America, listening to and learning from our customers, distributors, and others. Moving forward, I will continue to work tirelessly to bring great beers to consumers across our nation. So that was their response to this whole kerfluffle. Any key takeaways there that we might find interesting?
Well, I mean, it doesn't really address the controversy in any way, directly, indirectly. I think that you can read the subtext and notice all of the little references to the heartland and pride and patriotism. And you see that they're tapping into a few buzzwords that are popular with the community that they're concerned that they've offended, that are pushing the backlash against them for doing the little marketing promo, the TikTok influencer. So there's some kind of virtue signaling to their concept of middle America, but they do it in a way that is so indirect that it's almost comical. And, going back to the points that we've been making already, just like we were saying with the NFL as well, maybe it's true that these controversies have had an impact. We don't want to say that it's impossible. The NFL certainly acted like it was having an impact. Budweiser seemed to be acting like it's having an impact. But I'm skeptical. And like I said, there's sometimes a hypersensitivity and the need to, or the feeling of the need to react to everything, when often it can be best to say nothing and to do nothing. And this is actually going to feed pretty well into our discussion about the Donald Trump indictment. And I'm going to be making a similar point when we get to that, I think, because I think that we, especially in today with Twitter, constant communication and reaction, we have this phenomenon where people think that they need to react to everything. And they've convinced themselves that they do. But often you really don't need to.
One of the big changes over the last 10 years or so is that now communications professionals in these acute moments of crises, but also more generally speaking, are more involved with the C-suite decision-making, because communications is now viewed as a vital aspect of any large organization. And it should be. So you're the CEO of this company. You don't even know this marketing thing's probably going on. Then all of a sudden you see your company become this lightning rod. And by doing nothing and not responding, which appeared to be their initial stance on this, it's hard because you're getting constantly, it feels like you're in a foxhole. You're getting constantly bombarded and attacked. And, the people that are defending you, their voices are getting drowned out, and you're just focusing on the criticism. And then you have I would argue, maybe the bad PR professionals, the PR professionals who maybe don't understand that staying quiet could be the best course of action. And they are paid to, in their minds, do something. So they have incentives to try and manufacture a solution here through their hard work, through their ingenuity, through their adept way with words. Mr. Gunn said, if we just put out this statement, this will help us. And it's a perverse set of incentives, because you have the CEO who wants to say something, PR folks who are getting paid in some of their minds to put out something, when what you need really is, in this case, very likely restraint. So the incentives are all messed up, and I think that that's partly why we get this type of response when they should have waited.
I want to bring in a piece of social science research that is very relevant to this situation, and I think you're going to find it pretty amusing as well. So in 2007, a group of Israeli researchers, academics, we're looking into something called action bias, which is just what we're describing. The feeling that you need to do something. And they looked at football or soccer goalkeepers, and they studied penalty kicks. And they found that the goalkeepers would have saved more goals if they had just stood still. But they kept on jumping to the left or the right, thinking that that was their better chance of stopping the goal from going in. But if they had done nothing at all, if they had just stood completely still, they would have had a much better chance of blocking the goal. And that's the action bias at work. And when I play FIFA, I actually keep that in mind. And if I'm defending a penalty kick, I never move the keeper because I've remembered learning about this in school. And I think it's such a clever illustration of the action bias. But that's exactly the same thing that we're talking about.
That's the perfect imagery, John, to what we're saying. And, you do have people, I think it was Sheryl Sandberg, smart woman, come out and say, in every single instance like this, you need to batten down the hatches and say nothing. That's not true. Neither you or I are saying that there's a one playbook for all of these situations. What we're saying about with the information we have right here, it seems like saying nothing would have been better. And let's look at the responses. So for me, John, I agree with everything you just said. And I'll add in, if you go and look at one of the lines on this press release here, is they use the specific statement that Anheuser-Busch was founded on freedom, hard work, and respect for one another. Freedom and respect for one another could easily resonate with folks that are parts of marginalized communities. So they wrote this in a way where it really is a Rorschach test. And what do we have? I view this as a PR strategy. They're not caving. They're not apologizing. They don't think they did anything wrong. They are not saying even that they're going to stop the campaign. To my knowledge, the campaign is still going on. They're basically just saying, hey, you're angry, but we love freedom. What does that even mean? But the responses here are great because you had Ben Collins, NBC journalist, come out and tweet, Bud Light caves to a mob that was shooting at and running over its product for giving 1 minute sponsored post to a trans person. And then on the other side, you had Ben Shapiro. I don't have the tweet up, but he basically said the exact opposite. He was trashing Budweiser for coming out and not denouncing the topic, the issue, the advertising campaign that created this firestorm. So in this instance, you can see how by releasing this statement, they've given everybody something to get angry about. But I also do think that this speaks to a general bias in the media. We all know that Ben Shapiro is extremely biased, but for a reporter to come out here and call this a cave because they responded to something that is a national media story, it was getting national media attention. That died down. Now it's mostly right wing, but it's still going strong. To me, it just lays bare the ideological bias of Ben Collins, who is employed by NBC, but also from Ben Collins, a fundamental misunderstanding of public relations, of corporate communications, and of something that you really should have some type of understanding of as a journalist.
Yeah, so I don't think it's right to say that they caved. Like we said, the statement is hilariously non-committal, vague, difficult to interpret even. They didn't cave. They didn't say that they're going to concede the point to the angry right-wing people, right? But what they did do was they reacted. So they didn't cave, but they reacted. And today we talk about the attention economy. And when we look at these right-wing social media influencers, what are they really looking for is attention, isn't it? I mean, a lot of these people were failed actors or comedians, and they want people to notice them more than almost anything else. It's often less about the substance of their campaign, trying to achieve that. And it's more about finding opportunities to make a big stink and get people to react to you. And they seem to get much more pleasure from, antagonism than they actually do from achieving their ambitions. By reacting to them, they really have given those sorts of people exactly what they were looking for, aren't they? I mean, they have succeeded in getting one of America's largest and most recognizable companies to notice them, pay them attention.
To gamify this out, because I agree with everything you just said, what we are likely to see happen here, and this is the potential value of the statement, we're likely to see progressives and marginalized communities get pissed off because of tweets like Ben Collins and because of a lack of a full-throated defense of the campaign by Bud Light, which is, I would assume, a much smaller segment of their consumer base than your wholesale brand conservative. However, on the right, because this statement came out, you're going to have dishonest, I guess you could say, maybe an honest take. I think it's a dishonest take from Tucker Carlson, from other folks in the media who are ready to move on because the story has kind of played itself out. They're going to claim victory. And the benefit for them claiming victory from Bud Light's perspective, and probably what the consultants and PR folks were thinking, is they'll claim victory. And in addition to claiming victory, they will be able to say, hey, look, we held this massive American company to account. They are now more in line with our values. It shows our voices being heard. And to the audience, it will probably have the impact of rebranding Budweiser a little bit to be a little bit more conservative friendly and potentially get some of those lost sales back. So I think it was interesting. You know, it's a very interesting strategy, and cases can be made both ways. But ultimately, I think, like you said, these talk show hosts are going to take their out.
I think that next week we'll be on to another controversy, and I think that soon enough people will forget that any of this ever happened. There's been so many of these. Do you remember the M&Ms, Mr. Potato Head, on and on and on? Half the movies that get released in cinemas. Next, it's going to be Back to the Little Mermaid or something like that, and we're going to forget all about this. And I think that most Americans will never even be aware that this happened.
Yep.
So I think that at the same time as we're criticizing the television media and the company from paying attention to this controversy, we are spending 30 minutes talking about it. So we've done, I mean, we're not as, we don't have as big a viewership as Tucker Carlson, and we don't have as big a financial profile as Anheuser-Busch, but we have done exactly what we're criticizing and paid lots of attention to angry figures on right-wing social media.
Well, it's also in part, John, because we have expertise in this field, because we work, if not in it, related to it. For me, that's the fun part, is gamifying the strategy. And you know what, dude? I do think it's deplorable. I need to find a better word for that infamous word. But I do think the backlash is deplorable, disgusting, marginalizing folks for absolutely no reason than being different. And quite frankly, it's something that we're going to continue to deal with until companies learn to ignore this stuff. But I think it's nice to kind of segue into the Trump legal charges, because we will, the way we're going to discuss this is we will get into the impact that this has on the political sphere. We will get into the impact that this has on the media sphere, which we just discussed with Budweiser. But I want to start with the charges themselves, John, because a lot of people have made up their minds that these charges are good, these charges are bad, and I don't know how I feel about these charges. My understanding is that essentially Trump is getting charged for making a payoff to Stormy Daniels illegally, which is a misdemeanor, my understanding, in New York State, unless you can tie it to a felony, and then you can bump up the payment charge to a felony. I fully think, based on all the information we know and Trump himself, that he's very likely guilty. So that's not what I'm concerned about. I'm just concerned about, John, I view that you need to have a higher bar to bring charges against a president. The charges themselves, because they are minor and maybe the felony doesn't stick, ultimately help Trump out in the future politically, personally, professionally. So that's my concerns, and I'm really want to hear your take on everything on the legal aspects so I can kind of make up my mind and work our way through it during the show.
For quite a while, we were hearing that this indictment was probably going to come. And at that time, many commentators were, and those in the political space, were already jumping to conclusions about the case and the strength of the case and the justice of bringing the case. And at that time, I kept on saying, we shouldn't be drawing any conclusions now because we need to wait for the indictment. And when the indictment is published, then we'll have a good idea of how strong the case is. When the indictment was published, I was a little bit disappointed because it's a little bit light on detail. The federal indictments are often what's called speaking indictments, where they explain the charges count by count with a bit of narrative, explaining the story behind these charges, giving a bit of detail on why they're being brought. And these were used in a lot of the indictments that were brought by the special counsel's office, but also some other high-profile cases that have political implications in the last few years. Now, the indictment that came from the district attorney's office in Manhattan is not one of these. I was scrolling through the indictment trying to read it, and it's just really the same thing over and over again. It's just a list of 34 charges, which are all the same, that all say falsifying business records in the first degree, count 1. Count 2, falsifying business records in the first degree. Count 3, falsifying business records in the first degree. And with dates attached. So saying on October 18th, 2017, there was a false business record. On November 20th, 2017, there was a false business record. On and on and on. 34 times. Without really a lot of description about what this was. So at the same time as this was published, there was also a statement of facts published, which does give a little bit of the narrative and explain a little bit of why the case was brought and what occurred. But it doesn't really do it in a count by count way, the way that some of these speaking indictments at the federal level do. We're left to fill in the blanks a little bit and try to connect all these counts in the indictment to the narrative that's laid out in the statement of facts. You mentioned the high bar that it would take to prosecute a president. And, he is a private citizen, and this is not a federal court. So him being the president is maybe a little bit less material. But one thing that's really interesting about this is that if you look at the dates on all of these counts, they all actually occurred while he was in office as president. So, we knew that the catch and kill scheme with Stormy Daniels and the National Enquirer, all of that stuff, that occurred during the 2016 election. So before he was president, right? But if you look at this indictment, you notice that from the very first count, they're all things that occurred while he was in office as president. So the very first one in sequence, chronological order, is February 14th, 2017. That's, I think, 2-3 weeks after he would have been inaugurated, right? And I think that that's pretty interesting. I don't know if it really affects the legal aspect of the case, but it's an interesting note that the claim from Alvin Bragg's office is that all of these crimes were committed while Trump was president of the United States. And that's something that even if it doesn't affect the case, it's interesting historically, isn't it?
It is interesting historically. And just to parrot some of the legal commentators who we've been listening to, Ellie Honig, who we've had on the show, who I think has been one of the best on this subject, it sounds like what they're trying to do is potentially link a dinner that David Pecker had in the White House after he was president, along with the payments. There are texts between at least Michael Cohen and Trump talking about the timeline of paying. So I think that might have some impact and be part of their case. So it's both interesting legally and also interesting historically.
Our understanding, based on the analysis that we've heard, based on our reading of these documents, is that generally this count, falsifying business records in the first degree, it's usually a misdemeanor, but it's been upgraded to a felony. And the basis on which that's being done is because the false business records are related to an effort to hide a crime, another crime. So that crime is not charged anywhere near. Like I said, in the indictment, all 34 counts are all about falsifying business records. But if you read the statement of facts, you can see what they are considering to be the underlying crime that's being covered up by these false records. And the crime that they're covering up is perhaps a campaign finance crime. So what's interesting here is that the crime that this office is pointing at, the crime that they're saying is being covered up by these false payments, is not necessarily a crime in their own system. It's a crime perhaps in the federal system. So if you look at the statement of facts, you can see that they talk about how Michael Cohen pleaded guilty to making an illegal campaign contribution and served time in prison. So they're pointing out a crime that is known and already proved. They're saying, we already know that a crime happened because a court has already found a crime to have been committed and someone to have been incarcerated and convicted because of that crime. So we have a real crime. It's already proven. But this is a crime that was a federal crime. So the difficult thing here is this question about whether that can be transferred across these two systems of law. And Justin, you and I were talking about how the Supreme Court has, through other rulings, showed that they believe the federal and state court systems to be very, very separate. They said that these are separate sovereigns, that the double jeopardy rules don't apply across state and federal because they're completely different systems of law and they operate independently. And how relevant is that to this? I'm not really sure. A real legal expert could talk about that. But for me, it seems relevant because we have this question about whether, one kind of prosecution can transfer across these different systems of law. And the Supreme Court has said that it doesn't.
I think I'm against the charges for a few reasons. Number one, these charges need to be very clear about why what Trump did was wrong. It's a very straight line. And then because of what he did was wrong, here are the consequences. This is all murky. So if we don't know if the legal case is going to stand up to scrutiny in the court system, if it's very difficult to explain to the general public, which at this point it clearly is, and then even further, if it does hold up and if he is found guilty, there's not really a potentially strong penalty for this. Maybe it's a fine I've heard bandied about. So I think ultimately we're not going to really see any consequences from these charges. And the way that this is played out in the media, which was totally something that we could all project and understand was going to happen, ultimately strengthens Trump and his hold on the GOP and potentially the country.
I want to say a few things here. So first about consequences and Alvin Bragg's strength of hand in this situation. One thing that I want to draw attention to that I feel has maybe not gotten its full due is that in December, Alvin Bragg's office got a conviction of the Trump Organization on criminal activity. So in December, this office, the district attorney's office in Manhattan, they had a jury find two entities at the Trump Organization guilty on 17 counts of conspiracy and false business records. So this was not a civil case. We know that there's been these cases about Trump University and so on. Trump has ended up paying lots of settlements in lots of cases. But this was a criminal case about the Trump Organization, and they got a conviction. So I think that the Trump Organization really effectively has to be kind of dissolved now. And as it's currently constituted, would never be able to get a loan or anything like that. This is a pretty significant consequence. Trump's moved on to another kind of business now. Most of his business is about grifting people off of campaign donations and other schemes, some of which might end up getting prosecuted eventually. But the Trump Org, which was Donald Trump's main business entity for decades, it's been destroyed as a consequence of their own criminal activity, but also them being held to account for that by this office. They've already had an achievement when it comes to holding Donald Trump and his organization criminally liable. The other thing, though, about whether this is something that helps him politically and all of that, I think it goes back to a point that we had been making a minute ago about Budweiser. We're talking about how Budweiser paid attention to angry right-wing people on social media and how this was kind of its own victory for them in the age of the attention economy. And I think that that's something that we need to observe here, right? So why does this maybe help Trump politically? Being criminally indicted does not help you win over voters. No, it absolutely doesn't. And any people who suggest that, I think, are being ridiculous. But what it does do is keeps him at the center of the news cycle. It gives him lots of attention. And if Trump is going to be taken down by another Republican in a primary, there needs to be other Republicans that are getting some of that attention, that have the opportunity to build up a base of support among the voters that Trump had in the past. So no, Trump's not winning over new voters because of this. But if he's the only right-wing candidate that people are talking about even for negative reasons, and this is a very negative reason, it helps prevent the opportunity for other right-wing candidates to get the attention that they need to build their own support among that base.
The right-wing media now, no matter what they try and do, they're kind of pegged to Trump because they gave this full-throated defense. Additionally, the politicians, John, they came out and they voiced support for Trump out of fear, largely. I mean, you have I don't even know if it's true believers, right? Because I don't know if these people believe in anything, the ones that I'm going to categorize. I think that they are just the most grifty of these grifting politicians. So your Marjorie Taylor Greens, your Jim Jordans, they came out there and immediately supported Trump. Because of the way Trump acts, because of the media attention that he got from the right wing and even mainstream media in this instance, all these other politicians in their mind felt like they had to act. And I'll use Ron DeSantis as an example. Ron DeSantis comes out and it was almost like a Budweiser statement. He did say, like, basically, I think this is a political witch hunt. And then he went on to say other stuff that was not really germane and kind of ignoring the charges. Trump came out and attacked him. And it got to the point where all of Trump's little army, MAGA army, were attacking him. They were showing up to book signings and protesting Ron DeSantis. So that eventually this pressure, we saw that Ron DeSantis came out and made this ridiculous statement that once Trump was indicted and charged and arrested, that he was not going, if New York made their request for extradition, Ron DeSantis was going to fight it. So the pressure that Trump and the right-wing media put on DeSantis was, I think, largely driving other politicians to comment, not out of, oh, I need to get out there, but out of, oh, I don't want to be branded as an enemy of Trump by Trump, because what'll happen is the base will never forgive me and I'll be painted as a rhino for the rest of my political career. 538 tracking, since before Trump made the announcement that he was going to be indicted to April 11th, I think there's been a net of 10-point change from Trump to DeSantis. I think Trump right now in the 538 polling is at 49.3%. Ron DeSantis is roughly around 25%. So it has significantly damaged Ron DeSantis in the polls, which the polls are only a snapshot of today. And I think the other interesting case here is, I think that this and the charges, the response by Trump, the response by politicians, the response by the media also influences how they will act in future indictments. And I think we can both agree it's probably pretty likely Trump gets indicted at least twice, maybe 3 more times.
Yeah. So first, I just want to say, I think that legally speaking, this whole question of extradition is completely irrelevant and kind of ridiculous. So I just wanted to pour a little cold water on the significance of any of that discussion. But like you said, it plays into this whole political game that they're playing. You know, you talked about Trump's polling numbers. I wonder what Trump's own polling numbers were at this point in the 2016 cycle. He probably wasn't even being prompted by the pollsters.
I don't think he was. No.
Yeah. They probably weren't even considering him as a potential candidate. We're still pretty far away from the primaries. And
because to make your point, John, there was no primary at that point in time.
There wasn't a primary, and there's not really a primary happening now. I think that we've gotten into this ridiculous mindset about perpetual campaigns where we're actually almost 2 full years before the actual presidential election, and Trump is saying, "Oh, I'm a candidate." It's completely, under, it's not above board at all to indict a candidate for president. I mean, if you're a candidate for president now, then you can be a candidate for president at any time, ever, because we're about as far away from an election as it's possible to be. And we're still claiming that there's an election happening now. There's not an election happening now.
If you and I want to run for president in 30 years, based on Trump's logic, we can claim we are a candidate right now.
Yeah. I mean, we have national federal elections every 2 years. We're not in one of those 2 years now. And there's a claim that there's a campaign, an election happening. There's not an election happening. The other thing that I want to say, this kind of goes back to really what has been the theme of this entire discussion when we're talking about Budweiser and we're talking about this, is that people that you've described, the media entities and then the candidates, have felt that they needed to say something about all of this. And they really don't. Let's start with the media. The candidates, I think it's even more obvious that they don't really need to say anything. But the media, yes, the media, they probably need to cover this story. Do they need to cover it in this exact way, the right-wing media? They don't. They really don't. You know, you talked about the fear that they had that they were going to be overtaken by right-wing news startups that were only available on some cable networks that didn't even have national coverage on cable, that didn't have a high production value, that didn't have talented hosts, that didn't have a brand recognition. Fox News were so scared that they're going to be overtaken by these startups, OANN and Newsmax, that they defamed Dominion to the point where they might end up owing billions of dollars to this previously unknown company. They're so scared of, you know, Newsmax and OANN, which looks like someone broadcasting out of their garage, like Wayne and Garth in Aurora, Illinois.
I'm fairly certain you and I, if we put some time and effort into it, could create better production value than those shows.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's Wayne's World, and they're so scared that this kind of company is going to take their viewership that they made decisions that are so incredibly damaging to their own reputation and also bottom line. Think about all the money that they might end up having to pay in this Dominion case. That is all as a consequence of them thinking that they needed to tell these lies because they're so scared of these startups. They weren't. They would have been better off not telling the lies, not owing billions of dollars to Dominion, but instead realizing that these right-wing startups probably didn't really threaten a big fish like them.
And John, you're just describing like the mindset, the just comedy of errors made by the right-wing media and Fox News, which is a large driver of this. And it brings my mind to Succession, which is a TV show on HBO, basically about a media conglomerate. And I saw an article. I didn't, I read it, but I don't have it memorized verbatim or anything like that, which said that Rupert Murdoch is getting divorced. And one of the terms of the divorce was that his ex-wife cannot leak anything to Succession. So it really is some, like, their thought process, the management style, and everything going on at Fox News really is something out of a made-up TV show.
Well, I don't know how many people do or don't know this, but Succession is so closely based on Rupert Murdoch and his company that it actually was originally about them in particular. The original script to Succession was titled Murdoch, and the characters in the script were named Rupert Murdoch, James Murdoch, Lachlan Murdoch. It was originally a movie script written by Jesse Armstrong. And then it evolved into a TV show, and they realized that they would have a little bit more creative freedom if they didn't base it entirely on reality and added a lot of fictional elements. But the original script was not just about people inspired by the Murdochs, but it was actually about the Murdochs themselves.
We've probably discussed this before, but it makes sense now.
Yeah. Anyway, so Fox News did not need to cover this the way they have, in the same way they didn't need to cover all the other stuff in the way that they have, and it might end up costing them significantly. Now, when we get on to the candidates, the other politicians, I think that it's even more clear that there was no need for them to make these kinds of statements supporting Trump. And you've said that they were backed into a corner, they were forced to make these statements, and that's true to the extent that that's what exists in their own mind. And so often, behavior, we look at a decision that some public figure makes and we come up with a rationale and say, oh, well, that makes sense. But they make wrong decisions.
And you get on me all the time for that. Yeah. So
just because they've chosen to do this doesn't mean that it's the smart decision. Yes, there's a rationale, the one that exists in their own mind that's guiding their behavior, but it might very well be mistaken. And in this case, perhaps these figures felt like they were forced. They thought that they were forced to make these kinds of statements, but they really weren't. This was one of the busiest news days of the last 24 months. There was so much coverage. It was so oversaturated with discussion about this indictment. if Asa Hutchinson had not made a public comment about it, no one would have noticed. The public comment that he made is the proverbial tree falling in the woods. Did it even fall? Did it even make a sound? Because there's no one there to hear it. The same goes for Nikki Haley and so on. Ron DeSantis, he's perhaps the only exception to this. I'm sure that, voters in the public and in the media were looking to see whether or not he made a comment about it. Sure. But he also could have gone away with not saying anything. I don't think it would have been very difficult. And I think that his fear of being attacked by Trump is really not a good explanation for defending Trump at all, because Trump is already attacking him ferociously. It's a sunk cost. And it's inevitable that if you're running in an actual election against Trump, especially, but any candidate, you're going to be attacked. That's baked into your decision making. The only way for DeSantis really to beat Trump is to, challenge him, go head to head with him, and, defeat him in an open political terrain. And he seems still so reluctant to do that. So for him, I would question, even in his case, whether it was smart for him to make this kind of comment. But I think that he might still be the only exception in that question of whether anyone would be paying attention to whether he made this kind of comment. So again, I agree with you that the figures felt like they needed to say something, but they really didn't. Not at all.
Trump views these folks, the GOP elected elites, as being his hostage. These folks view themselves as being Trump's hostage. But the only reason why they actually are Trump's hostage is because they think they are Trump's hostage. If you actually had a leader in the GOP party, somebody that was making trends instead of just following trends, you would have seen a different approach, right? If, for example, Jim Jordan and Marjorie Taylor Greene go out there, that doesn't mean that Mike Pence has to go on CNN, give an interview that night, basically calling the charges a political witch hunt. No, a true leader would come out there, make their own statement, and then try and create support for that statement, that point of view, that ideology that they have. But the Republican Party right now, dude, it is just a bunch of followers, DeSantis included. In addition to that, the reason why it pisses me off and why I think I'm ultimately against these charges is you do have some very potentially serious cases coming down. You have the special counsel's case, which we think originated out of the classified documents issue. Another case is in Georgia, which is literally would undermine our regime of government. He was trying to basically get the governor and the Secretary of State to make up votes. These are two very serious cases. And I just fear that because of the orientation of the right-wing media ecosystem, because of the lack of leaders, what we now have is a GOP primary electorate who are going to essentially force the politicians, because this narrative is already out there in the Republican Party, to support Trump no matter the seriousness, no matter the obviousness of his guilt, for these future charges. And in doing so, if you're just always going to defend Trump, and if Trump is going to continue being indicted in different states and also in the federal government, then it looks like to your standard GOP voter in the primary who may not be following these issues that Trump is legitimately being persecuted. And you're going to be more likely to support him throughout the process. So I do think that it's likely that this indictment has sparked off and coincided with everybody seeing that DeSantis has no clothes, and ultimately really cementing Trump as the likely front runner. And that's why I'm just so apprehensive over all of these things. I don't want it between an 80-year-old Joe Biden and a potential totalitarian despot. I don't want that election.
If we're talking about the wisdom of bringing this indictment, the first question is, can you get a conviction, right? And that is, I think, where we're not really sure. Like we discussed, there are some unusual legal questions at play here that might make it difficult. And because it's such a politically sensitive matter, you do have to weigh the cost benefit of the likelihood of conviction and kind of the risks that come with all of the public attention that are coming on the case. So can you get a conviction, and what's the cost benefit of those risks? I'm not really sure. That's where there's still some question about the wisdom of bringing the case. The next question, was it just to bring this case? Are the charges actually serious? And from everything that I can see, I think the answer is probably yes. I think that the criminal conduct in question here is something that actually was very impactful. If we all remember the political situation in the late summer of 2016, remember this was right around the same time that the so-called Access Hollywood tape was released. And if the news had come into the public knowledge at the time that Trump had these affairs with these sex workers, because it was more than one, it was two. One was like a nude model for Playboy magazine. The other
Karen
was
McDougal.
Yeah, and the other was like a pornographic actress.
Stormy Daniels.
Stormy Daniels, yes.
And this is not because of my viewing pleasures. This is just I've seen them in the news a lot.
There was also another payment that went to a doorman who claimed that he had evidence that Trump had fathered a child out of wedlock, so to speak.
And they've debunked those charges, but I totally believe that happened. Maybe not with this doorman, but I believe that Trump has had a child out of wedlock.
I'm not aware of any evidence about that, but this is what matters, is that they paid this guy. They paid him a bribe not to bring this story public. They found out later that his story was false, but they went ahead and paid him a bribe and then falsified records to cover that up. So does this matter? Yes. If these stories had come forward into the public knowledge at the time of the Access Hollywood tape and all of that, that could have been enough to impact the outcome of that election. That's why it matters as a campaign finance violation, because it can be said to have really materially impacted the outcome. I mean, that's not the only reason campaign finance violations matter, but as we kind of consider the historical importance of this violation, we can kind of make that judgment, not a legal judgment, but a judgment about justice, right? The election was so narrow. Trump lost the popular vote by a significant margin, but he won tiny margins in a few states. Think about the number of votes that could have gone the other way, or people might have come up to vote who didn't go to vote. I mean, the margin was so thin that every factor was the deciding factor. There were so many deciding factors, and this can be said to have been one of them. The other reason why this, I think, is an issue of justice is that someone went to jail for doing this at Trump's direction. And is it fair that a lackey has to go and serve time and have that kind of legal punishment for doing something because he was told to do it by the head of that conspiracy, and for the head of that conspiracy not to face any kind of legal sanction? I don't think that that's fair. I don't think that that's just. If I'm a mob boss and I tell you to go and commit a murder, is it fair that you get all of the legal punishment for that, and me, the other person who made it happen, the person who was your superior, who commanded it, pays no penalty? I don't think that that's very fair or very just. So the fact that Cohen went to jail...
Well, John, I'm not a rat, so I'm not going to roll on you in this case.
Speaking just like Trump himself.
If you can't joke about these things, we'd be crying about them.
Yeah. So the fact alone that, I mean, I shouldn't say the fact alone, but the fact that Cohen went to jail, I think, for this actual crime, I think is a reason why it's just for the case to be brought. And then this next question about, is it best strategically for this indictment to come first when we know that there might be others coming? I think that it's not responsible for Alvin Bragg's office to think about it in those terms. And this is part of how we've gotten to the point that we have with this particular suspect, where he has evaded criminal penalty for so long. He hasn't avoided penalty. There's been lots of political penalties and civil penalties. And I think the idea that he gets away with everything is really wrong, because he has paid the price so many times, and he does often get caught. But in this case, the criminal indictments he's evaded them for a while because so many people are passing the buck on to others. So many offices are expecting there'll be a different one to go first. And we can't continue letting that happen. And it does trickle down into the political sphere as well, because a lot of politicians who wanted to come out and oppose Trump were waiting for the criminal penalty. They're waiting for this or that other shoe to drop. And eventually someone just has to go first. Now, the Georgia one might end up coming any day because we've heard in the news that that grand jury has already voted on indictment recommendations. So that, it might have been that one that came first because it's been around the same time that they're deciding. But we end up with this collective action problem if everyone is waiting for someone else to take responsibility. And look, the right-wing media machine is just going to say it's all nonsense no matter what. So whether it was Georgia that went first or Alvin Bragg's office that went first, the reaction is really not going to be that different. And someone has to do it. And, you talked about if he's being charged by all of these different jurisdictions, is he going to look persecuted? I would say perhaps what he will look like is a criminal. These cases have to be proven in court. And the offices that are bringing them believe that they can do that. Maybe they can't, but these are professional prosecutors who brought evidence to a grand jury and got an indictment approved and now are going to bring it to an actual jury.
Career-defining cases as well.
Yeah, so it's very risky for them. We know that there is some real substance here. It's not just a charge being put on the internet. It's a charge that they have the intent of trying to prove. So does it make him look persecuted or does it make him look like a habitual criminal? Lots of polls over the years have shown that most Americans, a quite large majority of Americans, do believe that Trump is a criminal. And that includes a lot of Republican voters, even people who voted for Trump. And I've heard these kinds of reactions from the right wing that really do, those that are the hardcore Trump supporters, that really do suggest that they genuinely do not believe in the concept of the rule of law. The first of which is them saying, if they come for Trump, they can come for me. And that's why I'm so outraged about this. And that is an excellent principle. If they come for Trump, they can come for you. That is a very good summary of what the rule of law is. The rule of law, it means no one's above the law. That's what the rule of law means. And that means that if they come for Trump, they can come for you. If they come for you, they can come for Trump. That's the whole concept. And it's a beautiful principle. So that being said is a bad thing. Is I think misunderstanding of the values that we have. The other thing is them saying, oh, well, it's now open season. The reason we shouldn't do this is if you go for Trump, then it's going to be us going after Clinton, us going after Biden. And what I say to that is also wonderful, beautiful.
Great. I don't want corrupt politicians and criminals in elected office. I think fantastic.
It's an excellent, excellent principle. And I hope that if there is evidence against someone like Clinton or Biden, that the prosecutors will not hesitate to bring charges. And I think that this is really the difference between people who really believe in the rule of law and those that are not, that either don't believe in it or are operating, purely in partisan or bad faith.
John, I want to jump in here and almost relate it back to the Budweiser discussion. You said the rule of law example, and also the we're going to go after Clinton and all them example is a misunderstanding of our values. And I would take a little bit of an exception with that and say that instead of a misunderstanding of our values, it just shows you how there are different sets of values between the general public that supports the rule of law and these folks that don't. Because when you were explaining both of those instances, I was thinking, oh, this sounds great. This is exactly how I want my system to work. And that goes back to the Budweiser thing, right? You had two different reporters from different ideological spectrums interpret the same statement in 180-degree different ways because they have different values. And while I still maintain I'm not supportive of the case because of the political ramifications, what I need to do, and maybe what our listeners need to do as well, is realize that any case of this magnitude, because our country is so split, it's going to be messy. You were saying Georgia could come first, and I just remembered about that poor, misguided Georgia grand jury forewoman, and she was out there very awkwardly giving all of these TV interviews. That would have been messy too. We can't have President Trump become reelected because democracy will be at risk. We don't know what's going to happen next. I'm always going to lean on the side of the action that minimizes the possibility that Trump wins the primary.
I think that there is a single anecdote that best demonstrates the difference between people who believe in the rule of law and are operating in good faith, and the others. And that is this. When Donald Trump was president, he issued a number of presidential pardons. They were almost universally focused on celebrities and other elite figures. One of the people that he pardoned was Rod Blagojevich. Rod Blagojevich was the governor, a former governor of the state of Illinois, who was a Democrat and who was involved in some significant corrupt activity.
He was trying to sell, literally, the Senate seat that was made vacant by President Barack Obama being elected.
Yes, exactly. So Blagojevich was convicted and imprisoned for doing this corrupt activity. So why did Blagojevich get pardoned? There's some reporting that says that Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's son-in-law and close advisor, de facto chief of staff, advocated hard for the pardon of Blagojevich. And the basis for this advocacy was his belief that the Democrats would be really happy about it. He thought that, oh, he's a Democrat. Blagojevich is a Democrat. If we pardon a Democrat, the Democrats are going to be excited. Of course, Kushner himself used to be a Democrat and is the son of a major Democratic donor who went to jail and is associated with other corrupt Democrats. But in his mind, mainstream Democrats, Democratic voters might be persuaded to forgive Trump for his other transgressions or vote for Trump or feel better about Trump because he had pardoned this corrupt Democrat. And this to me is the mindset of someone who is so far into the realm of bad faith and bad motives that not only does he have these kinds of bad motives in his own conduct, but he cannot even imagine that there are any other people out there who genuinely believe in the rule of law from a position of good faith. He thinks that everybody else thinks the way that he does, where if their side gets the ability to do something corrupt and get away with it, it's exciting. But guess what? A lot of us are not like that. A lot of us would love to see any corrupt public figure serve their consequences, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat. And that is one of the most important distinctions between, the perspective that we're sharing here and the perspective that has been repeatedly indicated by Donald Trump, the people in his circle.
If we all were to act like this, our system of government, the country would collapse, and it would be total disaster.